Good evening. This is your loyal host, William A. Wellman. In addition to creating Hello from the Hallowoods every week, I write novels, read horror stories, and tune into the work of other podcasters in the horror fiction space today. Sometimes I invite them into my dimly lit parlor for an armchair conversation about horror. In this bonus episode, I sat down with Tanya Ransom to talk about her influential horror anthology show and the trail she is blazing in audio drama today. This is the Skull Sessions Nightlight.
We are here today with the wonderful Tanya Ransom of Nightlight and Afflicted, two very different and yet very unique horror projects that have come out the last couple of years for audio drama. Tanya, what do you want your name to be known for in the horror space?
Oh man, that is an excellent question. I would say I want to be known for unexpected twists. That is always my goal with all of the writing that I do, is to, for it basically to be like a Twilight Zone episode. Like, oh, didn't see that coming kind of thing.
We had a horror writers panel together that we were invited to do for Invictus Con, which is the yearly event that Harlan Guthrie over at Malevolent runs. And you had mentioned the Twilight Zone during that combo as well. And it definitely was one of those pieces of media that, at least like very early on for me, sort of captured my imagination. And looking back on like Rod Serling's philosophy, he was not subtle about the fact that he had things he wanted to make society think about. And like he saw the show as kind of like an avenue to do that.
Yes.
I was curious where for you the horror genre first sort of captured your imagination. What sort of brought you into that lifelong interest in this corner of fiction?
Yeah. Well, I have 4 brothers, 3 of which are older.
That would do it.
And my dad loved horror. So he'd be watching horror movies, and my oldest brother is almost 10 years older than me. So, when I was, little, he's, teenager. And of course, once the bigger one starts to do things, then the little ones want to do it too. So my dad's watching a horror movie. My oldest brother's like, well, I want to watch it too. And then it just, kind of dominoes down. And, my parents didn't care what I watched as long as there wasn't sex in it. Like, sex was, no, can't do that. But, people getting decapitated, awesome. We'd totally watch that. And so I remember watching Candyman as a kid. And I can't remember if I watched Halloween or Candyman first. Like, my memory is not that good. But one of them I watched first. And, I just kind of fell in love with the genre, partly because, everybody knows that siblings, especially brothers, are ruthless. So, if I had showed any fear at all, I would have never heard the end of it, So I knew that I had to, look brave, and the way that I did that, in my child's mind was like paying attention to like the details of the story. At the time, of course, like I was kind of dissecting the story in, this very rudimentary way that, kids are capable of. But, that was how I kind of detached enough so that I wasn't afraid and, wouldn't jump and, things like that would get me made fun of. And I don't know, like something about it just, really spoke to me. I didn't have the best environment in my childhood, and horror helped me make sense of a lot of things. Like, how could God, I was raised in a Baptist household too. So it was, very like, well, how can God allow, all these horrible things to happen to, innocent people and to kids? And, why does my dad do the things that he does? I couldn't make sense of that as a kid, but, seeing horror and these monsters and then the people being the monsters sometimes helped me in a weird way make sense of, why the world is so shitty sometimes.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I would ask what ended up bringing you not only to take in these stories and kind of find something in them, but, also to begin like writing them yourself and like bring your own work. But I believe you mentioned maybe in our last combo that you had an early piece of Michael Myers fiction.
Yes.
That was maybe kind of that on-ramp.
Yeah, it was. So, I had a class project in second grade where we had to write and illustrate and actually create the book. So we had to get, cardboard and like bind the book ourselves, like everything from start to finish, essentially being a publisher. It was the greatest assignment ever. And my story was Michael Myers fan fiction, complete with bloody illustrations, him wielding a knife and, there's corpses. And, at the time, I thought, wow, I feel like I did a really good job of, like telling a good story here. And I was a really good kid in school, and the teacher called my mom. And I just assumed that the teacher called my mom because, like, she was impressed with my writing. And, it turns out my mom never told me this. It wasn't until much later that I kind of pieced together that conversation was that teacher was scared in a completely different way than I intended. But, I still caught that bug of like scaring somebody with my words. Just, I didn't quite scare the way that I wanted to, but I still got that feeling and, kind of got hooked on it. But I also told myself like bedtime stories at night. I always had a hard time falling asleep as a kid, like never could just, lay down and pass out. And I'd lay there and I would just make up stories every night. And that's how I put myself to sleep. So I've always told stories. That was just the first time that I put one down on paper and scared someone and got hooked on that on that feeling.
That's the kind of thing that sticks with you for life, really. Did you know, like, from then on that you were aiming to get into horror writing to, like, kind of work in that space? Or was there sort of a different period that led up to when you began Nightlight?
Yeah, I mean, the place that I grew up in, they were actually, like, they made national news for the amount of books they wanted to ban while I was in school there. So I was not exposed to a lot of like classic literature that other kids were. Like we actually had an assignment to read the first 5 books of the Bible one year for AP English. Like we read like The Raven by Poe, and that was like all that. I think we might have actually read like The Telltale Heart too as well. I can't remember exactly, but it was basically just a bunch of old white dudes. There was very little horror. Like if I wanted to read horror, I had to go buy it at the store. My parents were poor, so most of what I read just came from garage sales, and it was whatever I could find at garage sales that had an interesting cover. I never considered, I guess, because of the environment that I grew up in, that people could get paid to do it for a living.
Mm-hmm.
Like I just never made that connection, especially like somebody that looked like me and somebody that was writing horror. Like I just didn't think that it was a thing that was possible, that it was a hobby thing. And so in my head, it was always just, something that I did because it helped me feel better about things and it made me happy. And all through school, I would try to write horror for assignments, and, I would stick to the letter of, what the assignment was, but there would be horror themes in it. And I would always get chastised for, sneaking vampires into, the story or things like that. By the time that I graduated high school, it was very much, it's not okay to write about this stuff. This isn't, like real art, quote unquote. And, I just kind of gave up on it for a while. Every once in a while, like a story would come to my head and I would have to write it down because I couldn't get it out of my head otherwise. But it wasn't until I decided to go back to school to get my degree. I originally dropped out because my dad got sick, and I decided to go to work full time so that I could help support him. So I went back to school after he passed away, a few years after he passed away. And I had to take some electives, and I was like, well, I might as well take a writing class. Like, that'll be fun. And so I took a writing class, and my professor was amazing. And, she kept telling me, like, you need to do this. You need to put your work out there. You need to submit it places. Like, this is something that you could make a career out of. And I was like, wait, what? Because it just, it's funny to have so much imagination as a writer. I didn't have enough imagination to say, oh, this is something that people get paid to do for a living, and I can also get paid to do this for a living. Like, I had to have someone tell me that, which, in hindsight is like, wow, like how dumb am I? But, I'm really thankful for that professor because she's the reason that, I ended up where I am now, honestly.
Totally. It doesn't always come naturally, the idea that you can do the thing that you like and take that seriously and make that a full-time thing. There's so many podcasters that are like, yeah, this is my hobby. I put a full-time job of hours into this,
Right.
but it's all just for fun. So from that period, like, where did you start? Was that just in submitting stories to, magazines or anthologies?
So that same professor kind of gave us not necessarily an assignment, like it wasn't for a grade, but she did tell us, like, I want you to do this, consider it an assignment to submit our work to some magazine, that matched, whatever work that we had. And so I found this outlet called Creepy Campfire magazine, and I submitted my story to them and it got accepted. So the very first time I sent out my story, it got accepted and I got paid for it too. It was a paying publication. So I was like, holy shit, man, like this doesn't happen to like anybody, like everybody always talks about, this, long list of rejections that they have, and their first acceptance is one where they didn't get paid. And I was like, wow, this is great. And, I kept submitting my work, and then I started getting all the rejections, so I just go to, but that first experience of selling my work, and then, when it got published, because it was also a physical copy that I got as part of my payment as well, holding that, anthology in my hands with my story in it was an amazing feeling. It was just a really great feeling. And, I decided at that point that I wanted to try to at least make some money off of it. I worked in tech at the time, so I was making, quite a bit of money, and I knew it was going to take me a long time to replace the money that you make in tech with writing.
Yeah.
And, so I just, I just decided, it was going to be like a side project thing. And then, maybe one day I would, make it a full-time thing. So once that story got published, I'd wanted to start a podcast for forever. Really since before podcasts were a thing, I wanted to bring back old time radio. And then podcasts happened, and I was like, oh, okay, that's so much easier than trying to convince a radio station to write me a big fat check to, do a show that probably nobody's going to listen to, because nobody listens to the radio like that anymore. I decided to raise money for the first season of Nightlight just to see if people would be in, because I didn't want to do it and lose money. I didn't want it to be like one of those hobbies that cost you lots of money. So I decided I'm not going to do this unless I can at least break even. And so I set up an Indiegogo campaign for the first season. I didn't have an audience. Like, nobody knew who I was, at that time. Everybody that followed me anywhere was like a coworker or a friend or, someone that I'd met along the way. But I did the fundraiser for Nightlight, and I raised, I think it was like almost $2,000 with like, zero platform, which was, amazing. And it was enough to start the first season, and then people immediately started signing up to be patrons, to help me fund the next season. I was like, wow, people are really interested in this. This is really cool. It's not really my work, but, I'm helping these authors find their audience, and this audience find new authors. That was such a great feeling. And I had so many people reaching out to me saying, thank you for starting this podcast, blah, blah, blah. And then Nightlight started winning awards and getting nominated for awards. And I was like, okay, this is, what I can be doing. And then 2020 hit and I was unemployed and I needed to make some money. And I said, well, I guess this is my chance to make this writing thing a full-time gig. And kind of decided to put all my eggs in that basket because, nobody was hiring. It wasn't like I had other options. I could have gone to work at a hospital, but my son has asthma, and I was like, I don't want to be exposed and, expose him. So that's not an option. If I want to make money and keep myself and my child safe, this is my best bet. And so I finished writing a novella that I had, had in my drawer for, I don't know, it was probably a decade at that point, that it had just been like languishing, not going anywhere. So I finished that novella, kept producing Nightlight episodes, and I started thinking about what eventually became Afflicted, like how can I get this going? What do I need to make this happen, kind of thing.
One of the things I think people are often confronted with when it comes to like making a podcast for the first time is like, I'm interested in writing. I have stories I want to tell. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I think that would be a good medium for that story. But I have no idea like where to begin when it comes to making that viable. Mm-hmm. Where did you start when it came to taking a concept for a show and then with no existing industry cred, so to speak, making like a fundraiser for it.
I kind of treated the fundraiser as a proof of concept to see if people would, be interested in a podcast that published work written solely by Black horror writers and voiced by Black voice actors. Once I kind of proved, I guess, that people were interested, because, a lot of people started talking about it and they were sharing it and all of that, I was like, okay, people seem to be interested. I just need to get the word out to more people. And I used to work in marketing, was my former career. So, of course, I, leveraged that background and said, okay, well, I'm going to create a free resource. That'll be a way to get my name out there. And then, kind of attached to that free resource is, oh, by the way, I'm also doing this other thing. And so that free resource was a database of Black writers, regardless of what genre they wrote, whether it was nonfiction, whether they, pitched things to magazines and, did that type of writing, or if it was more like genre type writing. So I created that database and, had, several employers reach out to me and say, hey, I have this job. Can you, send some people my way that, might fit the bill for this, and I don't know if anybody ever actually landed a job out of it. My job was just kind of like connecting, and, if somebody did land a job, they never told me. But that was how I got a lot of eyeballs on me when nobody knew me. And I think that's what made the fundraiser successful.
Yeah, in marketing terms, this is what they would call a lead magnet.
Yes, exactly.
For our listener, a lead magnet in a marketing funnel is essentially a free piece of high-value content that brings people to you. And then from there, you can say like, hey, if you enjoyed this thing that I've created as a free offer, I'm crowdfunding for a bigger project as well, or whatever your ask is.
Yeah. And also, honestly, I got really lucky because the folks over at Pseudopod, another horror podcast that has been in existence for, I think they just did their 15-year anniversary or something. We've been in forever. Alex over at Pseudopod DM'd me and he was like, hey, I really like the idea of what you're doing. How can we help? And, they put it in their newsletter. I think they had a newsletter at the time. They announced it on their podcast. I just happened to capture some really good eyeballs with that lead magnet. And, it doesn't always happen that way. You don't always get lucky enough to get someone who can kind of influence things with your lead magnet, but I did. So that definitely contributed to my success.
I think it is not too delicate to say that there are not a lot of Black showrunners within the horror fiction space right now.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Looking at like the 25 horror shows that are in Rusty Quill's network, or at least in the horror, like genre of the network, and even probably like the top 30 in the space, there are arguably 2 or 3 like Black showrunners in that space.
Yeah.
So I was curious, when you began Nightlight and began crowdfunding and like raising awareness for that, were there any other like shows that you could look to for that like representation, or was it purely like, I've got to make this for myself because it doesn't exist?
Yeah, it was exactly that. It didn't exist. And, I did try to find like other Black horror podcasts that maybe I could say, hey, can you just announce my crowdfunding campaign on your podcast? And, I wasn't successful in finding anyone, that was a Black horror creator at the time. So, it was very much, okay, I guess, I'm carving out a space here. And, Fire Magazine had, they have a Black speculative fiction magazine. There's no audio component, but they were kind of doing this in a more literary space, so to speak. So I kind of modeled a little bit after them, very, very loosely. The types of stories that they publish in their magazine and the types of stories that are in Nightlight are very similar. I wanted to go for more of a Twilight Zone vibe with Nightlight, but knowing that they were achieving some success in that space, made me really hopeful that I could do that same thing in the audio space.
It is interesting to me that when shows like Pseudopod have been running for 15 years, when Welcome to Night Vale's been running for like 13 or so, that like it's taken until 2018 for a show with that focus to show up in the space.
Yeah.
Has the landscape changed at all today versus back in 2018?
Yeah, I would say, there's a lot more diversity, especially, if you look at the charts. It's no longer dominated by white men. Yep. There's still plenty of white men there, don't get me wrong. But, you see a lot of shows with a diverse cast, lead characters who are, people of color or, otherwise from some marginalized background. So I definitely see the landscape changing. And I think that that's wonderful. I think it's great that we're achieving a little more balance in the stories that are being told.
For audience information as well, like Nightlight is not all the Tanya show.
Yeah.
Like, your fiction does feature often.
Yes.
And I've enjoyed listening to like some of your work. But
Thank you.
On top of that, like I would say a good body of the episodes showcase stories from many different authors and often many different narrators.
Yes.
Delivering that work. How did you begin finding those people? Or like digging up that work to like include in the show? Do you have any like internal sort of scruples or themes that you look for?
Yeah. I would say, as far as how I found voice actors and authors, voice actors, I just posted on Twitter. I was like, look, I'm paying, because I've paid people since day one. I said, I'm looking for Black voice actors. Of course, like people are going to respond when you're like, I have money to give you, so it was pretty easy. I just created like a Google form and they submitted this form and, drop some links to their reels and I would listen and say, okay, they're a good, fit for this particular story. Of course, like I narrated the first few stories just because I didn't have anyone. But I found Sheree pretty quickly and, she's been pretty much a staple in Nightlight since the beginning. And I found a male narrator who, no longer is doing voice acting work, but, I needed a male voice for sure, for some of the stories that I had. But other than that, again, like, I just posted on Twitter, like, hey, I'm looking for, Black horror stories. If you're a Black writer, submit your story here. So, I got some stuff in Slush, like Lamar Giles, submitted something and I had no idea who this guy was when he first submitted, but I was like, well, this is a really great story. And then like, I looked him up and I was like, holy shit, this guy's awesome. Like he's a best-selling author. Like, how is he in my inbox submitting work to me? And then from there, it was like, going to conferences and anytime, I was at a conference and I knew somebody was a Black horror writer, I walked up to them and said, hey, I have this podcast, I would love for you to submit some of your work to see if we can get it published on the podcast, and gave them my card. And, it was just networking essentially. And, Black people talk, like we talk to each other about opportunities that are for us, so once you have a few people in the Black community who you've worked with and they can vouch for you, it's pretty easy at that point to get connected to other people because the Black community is just so good at helping each other out. As far as what I look for in a story, first and foremost, I think it's got to have a really good hook pretty early on because people are just not as patient with audio as they are with books. People will read like a whole chapter of a book where, nothing big is happening. Like the inciting incident hasn't really happened in that first chapter. They give books more time. Listeners, especially if it's a new podcast that they haven't listened to before, like you've really got maybe 2 minutes to get their attention and get them listening and, make them not stop essentially. So, a great hook that, comes up early, especially like an interesting premise, interesting twist on a trope. Always looking at stuff like that. And then, the twist endings. I love a good twist ending that you don't see coming. So that's always okay. Yep. I see you. I'll even, if a story has a really good premise and a really good twist ending, but it's not necessarily well written, I will work directly with, I'll tell the author like, look, I love this premise. I love this story, but the writing needs some work. Are you willing to work with me, on a pretty substantial edit on this? In most cases they say yes. And, I'll go through and I'll, make comments on, okay, this isn't working and this is why, and, that sort of thing. If the story's good enough, I'll put that work into developing it into something that is good enough to be produced for audio. I mean, and, the other thing too is that, I've got a lot of eyes on me right now. So there's a lot of pressure there too. I signed with a literary agent last year. I told a viral Twitter story last year and it got me a literary agent. It got me a whole bunch of new followers and it got me a TV and a film agent as well. And then I won a World Fantasy Award in October, November, something like that. So there were a lot of eyes on me as Afflicted was coming out. A lot of people were eagerly anticipating it. Mike Flanagan is a supporter of Nightlight and Afflicted, so of course I'm like, I don't know if he actually listens or if he's just like supporting me. Like, I'm thankful for his money. I hope that he listens too. But like, I try to pretend that he doesn't listen, because otherwise I'm just like, because I can't be Mike Flanagan. I can't be that. I mean, I maybe one day. I'm not that good right now, I should say. And it's almost like I hope he doesn't listen because I'm terrified that he's going to be like, "Wow, this is utter shit." Like, what is she doing? Um yeah, so yeah, I try to pretend that no one listens, because that is the only way that I'm not like crippled by anxiety.
And yet, I think often we are like our own harshest critics when it comes to like the
Yes.
nature of our work. In some ways, it is a bit of a blank canvas where it's like the things that I want to explore, I can in the story.
Yeah.
It is a way that you can showcase, I think, work that is very close to heart.
Oh yeah, yeah. And Afflicted is so close to my heart. It's a story about hoodoo, which is, something my family like kind of low key practice. They weren't like super into it. But I didn't know. I thought it was just like old black people superstitious stuff. Like, I didn't know that it had a name.
Mhm.
And, I started writing my novella, and I was doing some research, and I was like, holy crap, like all this stuff that my dad and my grandma used to talk about, like it has a name. It's called hoodoo. Um, and so I wanted to write a story that honored my family. Like, there's been a lot of death in my family. I have a very big family. And of course, you have more death when there's, bigger families, but we've had a lot of tragedies, a lot of untimely death in my family. And so the vast majority of the characters in Afflicted are based on people in my family that, I've loved and lost. Like, the main character, Mama Cherry, is a combination between my Aunt Cherry and my Aunt Ethel. My Aunt Cherry was, a firecracker. Like, didn't take any shit from anybody. My Aunt Ethel she was actually my great aunt. And she was the first Black nurse, I think, in Texas or California. I can't remember exactly. But she retired and she started a floral shop. So, the fact that Mama Cherry's character in Afflicted is, retired nurse who has a floral shop comes from my Aunt Ethel. Caldwell is my family's name. So, that's the name of the family in Afflicted. So it's just, it's extremely close to my heart, because it's like bringing my family back alive, which is, super cool. And then, just sharing our, folklore with the world, I think is pretty cool too.
What is your favorite thing to hear back from the audience?
Yeah, I mean, and it's different for both shows. Like, for Nightlight, again, I don't write the vast majority of the episodes. It's usually 1 or 2 episodes a season that are my stories. So, the feedback that keeps me going for there is, I just found this great new author, and, thank you so much. Or, I found my people, or, oh my gosh, I can't believe that there is, one place that I can go and I can just listen to stories. And, also hearing from authors. Like, there was one author who had a story published, and they created an audio version of it for the magazine. It was just, like a narrator, but the narrator wasn't Black. And so a lot of the aspects of the story, they just didn't voice it correctly. And typically I won't do a story that's already been published in audio, but this one had been published, like 5 years before. And, he wasn't super happy with it either. And I was like, it's a really good story, I'll do it. And, we did it, and he was so happy. And he was like, this is how I was envisioning it. And, thank you so much. So hearing that feedback from the authors, saying thank you for bringing my work to life, it does something for them, and, makes them feel really excited, and inspires them too. So it sort of creates this feedback loop, which is just wonderful. And for Afflicted, of course, like, since I'm writing it, I'm more sensitive about everything, but hearing things like, oh my God, I can't wait until the next episode, and, shock and surprise, and, like, I didn't see that coming, because of course, I love the unexpected twist. So, hearing feedback like that, where people are like, like chomping at the bit for the next episode, and, like, they're really excited about this, weird thing that they didn't see coming, that stuff makes me really happy.
Has podcast changed the way that you write? Because you are one of the few people here that both writes in a literary sense and then also writes for audio drama specifically. And in a book, you get that first chapter or two to hook them. In podcasting, you get the first 30 seconds.
My sense of pacing has gotten a lot better, because pacing is so important when it comes to audio fiction. I think the other thing too is that my writing, the prose writing has become more diverse in the senses that, I'm exploring, thinking of things like smells and sounds that are happening, not just thinking about what a character is seeing. So I incorporate a lot more sensory information, I guess, into my writing. And it's also informed, writing for screenplays. I put a lot of auditory stuff in the screenplays that I think most screenwriters wouldn't necessarily think of because they're not approaching it from the space of sound telling a story. Their visuals are telling the story. So I think it's made my writing more well-rounded.
Running a show where you get to curate and go through so much other like content, and like see how dozens of other authors do their work.
Yes.
I have to imagine that would like give some additional like insight as well.
Yeah, 100%. Especially even the ones that are quote unquote bad. I mean, some of them really are bad. Like I mean, there's no denying that. I can't say every story that I get is actually good. There's some that are just really bad. But one of the things that I would say, and I've heard this from people who have done work as a first reader for me for Nightlight, is they get a lot out of it because it helps them see the mistakes that people are making over and over again. So they're not making the same mistakes that, kind of get you chucked out of the slush pile. And also getting a sense of what rises to the top and what kind of, stays in the middle, because like it's good, but it's not quite as good as this. And like really figuring out that distinction between, yes, we're accepting this story and we're on the fence. We like it. We just don't know if we have enough room for it. And so, it gets either cut or accepted based on how many other great stories there are.
Looking around, at least here in 2023, I don't necessarily see the marginalized creators that I would like to see running as many of the shows around me as would be ideal.
Yeah.
Definitely like casting has improved quite a bit. Representation in shows has improved quite a bit. Like it's now, I think, pretty normal for shows to have a cast that is quite diverse.
Right.
But when it comes to the people who are doing the writing for these shows, I do not see a lot of them that aren't white.
Or the directing, showrunners, it's still very much not very colorful, place.
For the marginalized creators who are thinking about starting a show and, sometime down the line, like contributing to this landscape, is there anything you would want to tell those people?
I would say, first of all, make what you want to make it your own, be authentic. I think the first thing you have to do is you have to stay true to yourself and do something you're passionate about, especially, for your first project where you're not making a lot of money, because passion is the only thing that's going to get you through, when you're not making any money. You need that passion, because otherwise you're just going to be like, nope, I'm done. I'm not, this is a lot of work. The other thing that I would say is that it's really important as a marginalized creator, and I think it's always been this way, not just in podcasting, but it's really important to sort of create your own path, because we don't have the path that most other folks do. We just don't. So we have to kind of come at it through the back door, so to speak. So, create your own stuff, market the hell out of it, try to get important eyeballs on it, and it will get you somewhere eventually, and I mean, that's what's happened with me. Like it ended up being a viral Twitter story, that did it for me. Which was, super, it was a great experience, super cool, but it brought a lot of people to my podcasts, so it's all like this ecosystem that feeds, so don't put all your eggs in one basket. We were talking before the call and talking about how I overextend myself and sign myself up for too much, and part of the reason that I do that is because I know that, there isn't just one path to be able to make a living doing this. And I'm also one of those people that I get bored. If I'm only doing podcasts, I'm going to get bored. I need to have other avenues of writing. And so figure out which medium that you want to tell your story in. Do you want to tell your story in, two different kinds of media? Are you wanting to work in two different genres? Like really think about where you can have the biggest impact, where there are very few of us and very few of the stories that you want to tell in that space, and then tell your story in that space, because it'll be much easier for you to get noticed, I think.
A young man in the middle of the night stalks down to the shore of a forbidden lake. Moonlight glancing on the black water, discreetly looking around to make sure nobody's watching, drops a drop of his blood into the surface, waits for a couple of tranquil moments, and then shuddering up from beneath the water to hover over the surface of the lake are the bones of Tanya Ransom. What whispered words of advice does she give?
My advice would be, you are your own worst enemy. Don't hold yourself back. I didn't start Nightlight for a really long time because I kept telling myself this isn't the right time. I don't have this piece. I don't have that piece, and just, putting it off, making excuses. I could be so much further in my career right now if I had just done it and gotten out of my head and, stopped telling myself that it was the wrong time and it wasn't the right time. There is no quote unquote right time to do it. You just have to do it and hope that it works out. There's nothing you can do to predict the future to say, oh, if I do it on this date, then, it's going to be really successful. Like, you just got to do it now. That, and, I really struggle with mental illness a lot. And I don't want to necessarily say that like mental illness forces me to get in my own way, because it's an illness, right? Like, it would be like, flu got in my way and I couldn't work, like it's kind of like that. But you have to take some responsibility for healing, regardless of, whether you're healing from, something physical or something mental. And, for a long time, I wanted to blame other people for the trauma that I had experienced. And, yes, that trauma is not my fault, but it is my responsibility to fix the issues that it caused within me. And, part of those issues, like, killed self-confidence and, things like that. Like, I have to resolve those issues so that I do have the confidence to keep doing this. And, when someone writes a bad review, it's not like, oh my God, like I shouldn't be doing this anymore, kind of thing. Like, it's my responsibility to do what I can to overcome the limitations that I have, because everybody has some set of limitations, some, far more than others, but that does not mean that you can't do it. You just have to be more creative about how you get it done. So you have to put in more work, but you can do it. You just have to get out of your own way and stop thinking about all the reasons you can't and focus on the reasons that you can.
I think that's a wonderful note to leave off on. So thank you so much for coming on the show today. And for anyone who's tuning in, where should people go find you? What should they go check out?
You can go to pod.link/afflicted to listen to the whole first season of Afflicted. As for Nightlight, you can go to pod.link/nightlightpod to listen to that. You can find me on pretty much any social media as Mystifying, MISSDEFYING. But you can also find Afflicted at Afflicted Audio on social media, and Nightlight is Nightlight Pod on social media.
Thank you so much for coming on today. It's been an absolute treasure.
Yes, this was great. Thank you so much for having me.
Tanya Ransom produces the podcast Nightlight, a fiction anthology podcast showcasing Black perspectives and voices in horror. She also writes and creates the full-cast audio drama Afflicted. Go find Nightlight at nightlightpod.com or wherever you get your podcasts, and help drive weekly stories at patreon.com/nightlightpod. Or keep up with her latest projects at @MissDefying on social media. That's MISS Defying. Hello from the Hallowoods is produced by William A. Wellman. That's me. For first access to new Skull sessions with other voices in the horror podcasting space, look to the Hallowoods Patreon at patreon.com/Hallowoods.